She didn't see the hand coming. 1 second, Emily Carter was standing in the corridor of Redstone Veterans Medical Center, holding a patient chart and minding her own business. The next, Lieutenant Daniel Brooks had his palm flat against her shoulder, shoving her backward toward the exit doors hard enough that she stumbled into the wall. The chart hit the floor. 2 military officers standing nearby didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. Then Brooks stepped closer, jaw tight, voice low and shaking with something that had been building for a long time. "You don't belong in that room," he said. "You don't belong in this building." Emily straightened, touched the corner of her mouth where her lip had split against the doorframe, looked at the blood on her fingertip. Then she looked at him, calm, steady, the way a person looks when they've already survived the worst thing that can happen to them. "I was there the day your brother died." The corridor went absolutely silent. If you're watching this story for the first time, stay until the end. Like this video, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and subscribe so you never miss what happens next. I want to see how far this story travels. Redstone Veterans Medical Center sat on the eastern edge of Ashbury, Colorado, a city that existed mostly because the military had decided decades ago that the surrounding flatlands were useful. The hospital was a place of institutional beige walls, fluorescent corridors, and the particular kind of quiet that settles over buildings full of people who have already been through the loudest thing imaginable. It served active duty personnel, veterans, and their families. It was run on federal contracts, watched over by a rotating cast of military liaisons, and staffed by a mix of military medical personnel and civilian caregivers hired to fill the gaps. Emily Carter fell into the second category. On paper, she had been at Redstone for 14 months. 31 years old, compact and unremarkable in her navy scrubs, with the kind of face that people forgot almost immediately after looking at it. She kept her dark hair pulled back. She didn't wear jewelry. She didn't personalize her locker. She showed up early, stayed late, and performed every task assigned to her with a precision that was slightly unusual for a civilian nurse, but that nobody had bothered to investigate because the understaffing was chronic and the hospital administration was happy to have warm, competent hands. Her supervisor, charge nurse Patrice Okafor, liked her. "Emily's the one you want when things go sideways," Patrice had told the unit manager once. "She doesn't rattle." She hadn't meant it as a compliment exactly, more an observation. Some nurses went quiet under pressure because they were freezing up. Emily went quiet because she was thinking 3 steps ahead, and thinking didn't require noise. The patients noticed too, in their way. The veterans especially. There was something about Emily. The way she moved through a room, the way she assessed a situation before she walked into it fully, the way she never flinched at the harder cases, that made the men and women who had served feel, without quite understanding why, that she understood something the other civilian staff didn't. Nobody asked what that something was. In a hospital full of people carrying things they didn't discuss, it would have been rude. That Tuesday started like every other. Emily clocked in at 6:45, checked the overnight notes, and began her morning rounds. Ward C, which housed post-surgical recovery for patients transferred from Walter Reed and similar facilities, was her primary assignment. 8 patients. 3 of them newly post-op, which meant pain management checks every 2 hours and careful monitoring of vitals that could shift without warning. She moved through the ward methodically, the way she always did, pausing at each bed long enough to actually look at the person in it, rather than just the monitors attached to them. She was in the middle of adjusting the IV line for a staff sergeant named Tomas Vega, 34 years old, femur reconstruction, 2 tours in the kind of places that didn't get named on the news, when she heard voices in the corridor outside. Military voices. The specific register of people who were used to being listened to in large rooms. She didn't stop what she was doing. She finished the line check, noted Vega's vitals on his chart, and said something quiet to him that made the corner of his mouth twitch upward before she moved to the door. The corridor had filled up in the last few minutes. 3 men in uniform, 1 a full colonel, 2 captains, were moving toward the administrative conference room at the end of the hall with a hospital administrator named Gerald Marsh trailing behind them, holding a folder and talking too fast in the way people did when they were nervous. A fourth man walked slightly apart from the group. Lieutenant Daniel Brooks. Emily had seen Brooks before. He'd been attached to the facility liaison office for 6 weeks, nominally overseeing coordination between the military's patient advocacy office and hospital administration. In practice, this meant he attended meetings, read reports, and occasionally appeared on the ward in his dress uniform to check on specific patients he considered personally important. He was 29, broad-shouldered, with the kind of posture that came from years of being told to stand up straight and had eventually become involuntary. He had a brother who had died during a classified operation in a mountainous region that wasn't being discussed publicly. Emily knew that because it was on file. She also knew things about it that weren't. She watched them pass. Brooks's eyes moved over her the way they always did. The quick dismissive scan that registered her as a civilian nurse and moved on. She was used to it. She went back to her rounds. The morning progressed. At 9:15, Emily was called to consult on a patient in the secure ward, Ward F, which required a secondary clearance badge to enter and housed personnel whose cases involved injuries sustained during classified operations. Her clearance for Ward F was routine. She'd been approved for it in her 3rd month after the unit nurse had gone on emergency medical leave and Patrice had put Emily's name forward as a reliable substitute. The approval had come through without issue, which, looking back, said something about how thoroughly her background had been reviewed. Or hadn't been. The patient in Ward F who needed attention was a 26-year-old Army Ranger named Marcus Webb, who had been running a low-grade fever since the previous evening, and whose drainage site from a shrapnel removal was showing early signs of infection. Emily examined the site, changed the dressing, adjusted his antibiotic protocol, and was documenting the change when the door opened behind her. It was one of the captains she'd seen in the corridor. He stopped when he saw her. Who authorized a civilian in this ward? Ward supervisor, Emily said, without looking up from the chart. Charge nurse Okafor, temporary assignment. My clearance is current. I don't care what your clearance says. This ward is off limits during the security review. Emily finished her note, capped her pen, and turned around. The patient has an infection developing in a post-surgical site. If I leave without completing the protocol, you're looking at a sepsis risk within 48 hours. The captain stared at her. He was not accustomed to being responded to with clinical information instead of compliance. Finish up and get out, he said finally, and left. She did finish. She also, while she was documenting, noticed that Marcus Webb was watching her from the pillow with the particular alertness of someone who has been in enough situations where reading the room was a survival skill. You're not scared of him, Webb said. I don't have a reason to be, Emily said. Most people find a reason pretty quick when a captain uses that voice. Most people haven't heard worse, she said, which was a more honest answer than she'd intended to give. She closed the chart. You need to stay on the antibiotic schedule. I'll make sure it's noted for whoever covers the next shift. She left Ward F, walked back down the corridor toward the nursing station, and had approximately 4 minutes of ordinary morning before everything shifted. Gerald Marsh appeared at the nursing station looking flustered, which was his default state, but was currently several degrees more intense than usual. Behind him were 2 of the military liaisons from the corridor group, and behind them was Lieutenant Brooks, who had apparently decided that whatever the security review required, it required his personal attention on this ward at this specific moment. Ms. Carter! Marsh's voice had the particular quality of someone delivering news they didn't write, but were obligated to read out loud. I need you to step out here, please. Emily set down the chart she was holding and came around the nursing station. She looked at Marsh. She looked at the liaisons. She looked at Brooks, who was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not the routine dismissal, but something more specific, harder, like he'd been given information about her and was deciding what to do with it. There's going to be a briefing this afternoon, Marsh said. Security protocols for the duration of the review. Civilian staff on Ward C will be restricted from the East Wing. The East Wing includes Ward F, Emily said. Yes. I have a patient in Ward F with an active infection that needs monitoring every 6 hours. Military medical staff will handle it. Military medical staff on this shift is down 2 people because of the emergency transfers from Fort Haley last week. I've been covering the gap. Marsh looked uncomfortable. One of the liaisons stepped forward. Ms. Carter, this isn't a negotiation. The review protocol supersedes regular staffing arrangements. You'll be assigned to the West Wing for the duration. All right, Emily said again, which was not agreement, but was the word she reached for when what she actually wanted to say was not going to help anything. Brooks stepped closer. He was taller than her by 8 inches and was doing the things some people did with height, using proximity as punctuation. I've read your file, Ms. Carter. You've got a nursing degree from Kellam Community College and 14 months of post-hire experience. You have no business being in a secured military ward. I was assigned to that ward because the unit is understaffed, Emily said, and because my work has been adequate. Adequate. The word came out of his mouth like he found it offensive. You're a civilian caregiver in a building full of people who served. Adequate is the floor, not a credential. It was the kind of thing people said when they needed to establish that someone didn't belong somewhere. Emily had heard it in different forms, in different places, from people who were usually eventually surprised to learn they'd been wrong. She could see from Marsh's face that he knew this was getting into territory that would require paperwork, and from the liaisons' faces that they were going to let Brooks run this wherever it went and then walk away clean. She breathed out through her nose. Is there something specific I've done wrong, Lieutenant? A patient outcome I've mishandled? A protocol I've violated? It's not about what you've done. It's about who has access to what in this facility and whether that access has been appropriately vetted. Then review my clearance. If it's a problem, revoke it. But Webb's infection will be handled. Brooks moved toward her again, and this time the motion wasn't punctuation. It had an edge to it that was closer to pressure. I'm going to need you to step away from this wing. Emily held her ground for exactly 1 second. One deliberate, visible second, long enough to make clear it was a choice, and then took a step back toward the nursing station. She turned to pick up Corporal Webb's chart to pass it off to Patrice. She didn't hear him move. She was reaching for the chart when his hand came down on her shoulder and shoved, hard enough that she went forward into the corner of the nursing station and caught herself on the counter. The chart fell. Her lip caught the edge of a metal clipboard tray. The corridor went still. Patrice Okafor, who had appeared from the break room at entirely the wrong moment, stood frozen in the doorway. The two liaisons looked at each other without looking at each other. Marsh made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Brooks had gone very still, the kind of still that came after an action that had outpaced the decision to do it. Emily straightened up. The metallic taste of blood was on her lip. She pressed her tongue against it once, then pulled her hand away and looked at the small smear of red on her fingertip. The silence held for 4 seconds. 5, 6. She looked at Brooks. He was looking back at her, jaw tight, and there was something behind the anger now. Something more complicated. Something that might have been grief wearing the wrong face. I was there the day your brother died, Emily said. It was quiet enough that even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum louder by comparison. Brooks' expression did something complicated and then went flat. What did you just say? Operation Nightgate, Emily said. September, 4 years ago, Cavern Province. She said the words the way you said the name of a place you'd been to in your body, not just read about. His name was First Lieutenant Aaron Brooks. He went down in the second vehicle when the road hit the secondary charge. The extraction window was gone before the fire team could reach the vehicle. 3 men made it to the drainage ditch on the north side. She paused. Aaron was not one of the 3. The sound Brooks made was not quite a word. He took a step toward her. Who told you? His voice had dropped into something different, lower, rougher around the edges. Nobody told me, Emily said. She reached into the chest pocket of her scrubs, pulled out something small, held it out in her open palm. A dog tag. Worn at the edges, the chain broken and knotted back together. Aaron Brooks. Blood type B positive. Army. The information stamped into the metal was 6 years old. Daniel Brooks stared at it. Then at her. Then at it again. Where did you get that? His voice had gone to something barely above a whisper. He placed it in my hand before the explosion, Emily said. He told me to make sure someone got it home. The two liaisons had forgotten they were trying to look neutral. Patrice Okafor had both hands over her mouth. Marsh was gripping his folder so hard the cardboard was bending. Brooks reached for the dog tag, then stopped before he touched it. His hand hovered an inch from Emily's palm. He was looking at her face like he was trying to find something in it, a lie, a tell, some crack in whatever she was doing. He'd expected fear when he pushed her, or compliance. He'd expected something from the category of reactions a civilian nurse gave when a military officer made himself physically clear. He had not expected this. "That information is classified," he said, not because it was a relevant point, because it was the only thing his training was offering him right now. "Yes," Emily agreed, "it is. You can't know any of that. And yet, who are you?" The question came out lower and slower than the others, like he was asking it under different circumstances than the ones he'd thought he was standing in 30 seconds ago. Emily closed her fingers around the dog tag. Her hand was perfectly steady. "I think," she said, "that's the conversation you've been trying to avoid having since you read my file." Behind her, down the corridor near the entrance to Ward F, a door opened. The colonel who had arrived that morning stepped into the hall and looked toward the group of them. Took in whatever he was seeing, Brooks's face, Emily's lip, the particular quality of silence that had settled over the whole section of hallway. "Lieutenant," the colonel said. His voice was measured, careful. "What's happening here?" Brooks didn't answer immediately. He was still looking at Emily, and in his expression was a conflict that had nothing to do with hospital policy or security clearances. It was something older and rawer than that, something that lived in the specific territory between grief and the need to blame something for it. "She needs to be removed from the facility," he said. "On what grounds?" A pause, long enough to be its own answer. "She's a civilian with access she shouldn't have," Brooks said, "and she's making claims about classified operations that she has no business knowing." The colonel looked at Emily, at her lip, at the fact that she was standing very calmly in a position she hadn't chosen but wasn't retreating from. "Ms. Carter," he said, "is there something I need to know?" Emily looked at the colonel. She had been waiting, she realized, with the particular precision of someone who had been keeping track of time in a way nobody around her knew about, for almost 14 months for a version of this conversation. She had hoped it wouldn't start this way. She had hoped the briefing, when it came, would happen in a controlled setting with the right people in the right chairs. But she had also prepared for it to happen like this, in a corridor, in scrubs, with blood on her lip and a dog tag in her hand. She looked at the colonel, and she said with the same steadiness she brought to everything, "Yes, sir. I think there are several things." The colonel's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. He looked between her and Brooks, and then, very deliberately, at his watch. "My office," he said. 10 minutes. He turned and walked back down the corridor without waiting for anyone to confirm. Emily pocketed the dog tag. She bent down and picked up Corporal Webb's chart from where it had fallen, set it on the nursing station counter, and turned to Patrice. "Webb needs his 6-hour check at 2 o'clock, she said. "The drainage site needs redressing before evening. The protocol is in the chart." Patrice stared at her for a moment. "Emily, I'll brief Patrice on the rest when I get back." She said it like there was a when, not an if. Then she turned and walked down the corridor toward the administrative wing, past the 2 liaisons who stepped out of her way without quite meaning to, past Marsh who was already reaching for his phone. She passed Brooks last. He was standing exactly where he'd been, the dog tag gone from view, and the question of where she'd gotten it still sitting unanswered in the air between them. She didn't look at him when she passed. She didn't need to. Behind her, she heard him say quietly, to no one in particular, "That's not possible." And she kept walking. The colonel's name was Raymond Stokes, and he had been at Redstone for 8 days, which was long enough to know there was something off about the records review he'd been sent to conduct, but not yet long enough to know exactly where the offness lived. He was 61 years old, had the kind of face that had been weathered into its final form by the time he was 50, and had spent 4 decades in Army medicine in positions that had given him a highly developed sense for when a situation was about to become something significantly larger than it appeared. That sense was currently running at full volume. He sat behind the administrator's borrowed desk in the administrative conference room, his hands flat on the surface, and watched Emily Carter sit down across from him with the particular stillness of someone who had decided what they were going to say and was not going to be moved off it. "You want to start from the beginning," he said. "Yes," she said. "Though I should tell you up front that the beginning is going to sound like something you'd dismiss immediately. I'd ask you to stay with it anyway." Stokes looked at her. "That's an unusual way to open a conversation with a senior military officer." "This is an unusual situation." He nodded, once, which was neither agreement nor disagreement, but was a signal to continue. "My name is not Emily Carter," she said. The colonel's hands didn't move from the desk. "What is your name?" "My operational name, before I left service, was Mira Voss, Staff Sergeant, 75th Medical Support Detachment, attached to Special Operations on a rotational basis from 2017 through 2021. I was officially listed as KIA in the aftermath of Operation Nightgate." Stokes was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then, "Operation Nightgate is classified." "Yes, I'm aware. I was there." "Staff Sergeant Voss is dead." "I know what the records say. I've read them. Someone else filed that report."
"Do you know who?"
Mira, looked at him steadily. "I have a good idea, but that's for the investigators. What I know is that I survived. I spent 3 years outside the system, gathering documentation of what actually happened on that mission and in the 6 weeks of command decisions that led up to it." Stokes leaned back slightly. He had the look of a man running a large amount of information against a framework that was having trouble accommodating it. "You're saying you intentionally stayed off the record." "I'm saying I stayed alive long enough to do something useful with what I knew." "And you ended up here." "This facility had the records I needed access to, the transfer files from the mission, the command logs, documents that hadn't been fully sanitized yet because the people who needed to sanitize them believed I was dead and not looking for them." Down the hall, Emily could hear footsteps. Brisk ones. More than one person. She didn't break her focus from Stokes. "There are investigators assigned to this review," she said. "I need them in this room." "Ms. Whoever you are, Voss," she said. "And the investigators need to be in this room before Lieutenant Brooks has time to file a report about this conversation, because once that report is filed, the window gets much smaller." Stokes stared at her. Then he reached for the phone on the desk. And in Ward C, down the corridor that Emily had walked every day for 14 months, the monitors on Corporal Webb's drainage site began to alarm, a sound that nobody wanted to hear, and that, in the specific geometry of this particular morning, meant that the person best equipped to handle it was currently sitting in an administrative office explaining to a colonel that she was not who her employment file said she was. The day was not finished with any of them yet. The alarm from Ward C reached the conference room as a distant pulse. 3 short beeps, then 3 more, the kind of rhythm that meant something was changing in a patient's body faster than it should. Stokes had the phone halfway to his ear when Emily was already out of her chair. "That's Webb," she said. "Sit down." His drainage site was showing early sepsis indicators 2 hours ago. If that alarm is what I think it is, you have about 4 minutes before it becomes a much harder problem. She was already at the door. "Make your call, Colonel. I'll be back." She didn't wait for permission. She moved down the corridor at a pace that wasn't quite running but covered ground like it was, past the 2 liaisons who were still loitering near the nursing station and who stepped aside without thinking about it, past Marsh, who was on his own phone, and looked up at her with an expression that had given up trying to be authoritative. She pushed through the door to Ward C and went straight to Webb's bed. His fever had spiked. The drainage site. She'd known it when she'd changed the dressing that morning, known it the way you knew things when you'd spent years making fast decisions in environments where slow ones got people killed, was angrier than the protocol had flagged it. She called for the charge nurse, didn't wait for the response, and had the dressing off and the site assessed before the ward's assigned nurse appeared at the curtain with a look that mixed relief with resentment in the specific ratio that said, "I was going to handle this." "Get me a culture kit and tell Dr. Nakamura his 2 o'clock is going to need to move," Emily said. "Webb needs a broader spectrum antibiotic, and he needs it in the next 30 minutes. "You're not... I thought you were pulled from this wing." "I'm here now. Culture kit." The nurse left. Webb was watching her from the pillow, same alert stillness as before, though his color was worse and the sweat on his forehead was the wrong kind, the kind that came from a body working too hard on the wrong problem. Worse than you thought this morning? He asked. A little, she said, which was honest. She was palpating the edges of the site with gloved hands, careful and systematic. You should have mentioned the pain rating was higher than you told me. Didn't want to be a problem. Being a problem at 2 in the afternoon is better than being a crisis at 2 in the morning. Fair, Webb said. He watched her work. There's something going on out there. The corridor's been running hot all day. Focus on breathing slow. Let your body stop working against itself. That in order? That's a suggestion from someone who would like your infection to stay local. She stepped back as the nurse returned with the culture kit, went through the collection procedure the right way, which took longer than shortcuts but mattered, and was writing up the antibiotic escalation order when she registered that someone else had come into the ward. Daniel Brooks was standing at the curtain. He wasn't in motion. He was just standing, watching her work, with an expression that had lost whatever structure it had worn in the corridor. What was left underneath was less organized, more human. The kind of face people made when something they'd been certain about had shifted under them and they hadn't figured out yet how to stand on the new ground. Emily didn't stop writing. I'll be done in 4 minutes. I'm not here to pull you out. She looked up. Then what are you here for? He didn't answer immediately. He looked at Webb, who looked back with the frank, measuring gaze of someone who had spent years reading rooms and people quickly and had no particular reason to perform polite disinterest. Brooks looked back at Emily. The dog tag, he said. I need to know how you got it. I told you. You told me something that's not possible. Emily capped her pen and handed the order to the nurse. She stripped off her gloves and turned to face Brooks more directly. She was aware of Webb listening with his eyes half closed in the way patients did when they wanted you to forget they were there. Aaron was in the second vehicle, she said, quieter. The IED hit the front axle. He wasn't unconscious, not immediately. He got out of the vehicle and pulled 2 men clear before the secondary charge went. When the fire team couldn't reach us, he made the call to move north toward the drainage ditch. He gave me the tag because his hands were... She stopped. He gave it to me because he knew the shape of the next hour better than I did. He told me to make sure it found its way back. She paused. He was looking for you when he said it. Your name was the last full sentence he spoke. Brooks's jaw was working. He had the look of a man trying to keep his face from doing something he'd decided it shouldn't do in a room with other people. You're claiming you were on that mission, he said. His voice was flat in the way voices went flat when they were doing load-bearing work. I'm not claiming it. I was there. Staff Sergeant Voss was KIA. I read the report. I've read it 100 times. Then you should have some questions about who filed it, Emily said, because I didn't, and I was the senior medical personnel on scene. The silence that followed had weight to it. Webb had stopped pretending to be asleep. The charge nurse had found something to organize at the far end of the ward that required her complete attention. Brooks took a single step toward her, not aggressive this time, more like he needed to be closer to hear the next part, even though the room was quiet. Who are you? That's the second time you've asked me that today. I'd like an answer. You'll get one, she said, in the colonel's conference room with the right people present, because the answer comes with about 200 pages of documentation, and some of those pages have names on them that are going to make this morning look uncomplicated. She held his gaze. I need 30 minutes with Corporal Webb's antibiotic protocol sorted. Then I'll come. Brooks looked at her for a long moment. Something was moving behind his eyes that she couldn't quite read. Not the anger from the corridor, something more tangled than that. He nodded once and left. Emily turned back to Webb. He was watching her openly now. The pretense dropped. Sounds like a story, he said. Get some sleep, Emily said. Not a chance, said Webb. The antibiotic order went through. Dr. Nakamura, a compact, serious man in his 50s who ran the post-surgical unit with the energy of someone who had long ago accepted that half his job was cleaning up other people's decisions, reviewed Emily's assessment, agreed with it in 3 words, and signed the escalation without asking her why she was still on the wing. He had been at Redstone long enough to have noticed that the administrative dramas that periodically roiled the civilian staff rarely intersected with good patient outcomes, and he had a pragmatist disinclination to let them. Emily washed her hands, updated the chart, and gave the ward nurse a brief rundown of what to watch for in the next 6 hours. Then she walked back to the administrative wing, and she felt, as she walked, the specific quality of alertness that came from knowing that the next hour was going to change the shape of everything that followed it. The conference room had expanded since she'd left it. Stokes was still behind the desk, but now there were 2 other people in the room, a woman in civilian clothes with a military bearing that she wasn't trying to hide, and a man in his 40s in an Army JAG uniform whose presence meant that whoever Stokes had called, he'd called the right people. Brooks was already there, standing against the far wall with his arms at his sides. Marsh had been quietly removed from the situation, which was the smartest decision anyone had made all morning. Emily came in and sat down. She looked at the JAG officer. "You're investigating the Nightgate records review," she said. It wasn't a question. The JAG officer looked at Stokes. Stokes nodded slightly. "Captain Lena Ferris," the woman said from the chair beside him. "Inspector General's office. And yes, the records review includes Nightgate." "Good," Emily said. "Then you need to know that the file you've been working from has been altered. The incident report, the KIA designations, the command log from the 72 hours before the mission, all of it, selectively, carefully, but not carefully enough." Ferris had a legal pad in front of her. She hadn't written anything on it yet. "You're making a significant claim." "I'm making a documented claim," Emily said. "There's a difference." She reached into the lower pocket of her scrubs and produced a small USB drive. "This has been with me for 14 months. It contains the operational command logs from the 48 hours preceding Nightgate, cross-referenced against the official version. It has medical records from 3 of the personnel listed as KYA, including 2 who are not dead. It has communication transcripts from command that were supposed to have been deleted." She set the drive on the table. "I've been waiting for the right investigation with the right scope to give it to." Nobody in the room moved immediately. Ferris looked at the drive. The JAG officer looked at it. Stokes looked at Emily with the expression of a man recalibrating something major. Brooks pushed off from the wall. "Where did that material come from?" "Some of it I had when I went off record. Some of it I gathered here." She said it without inflection, which was the only way to say it. "Your records room has some gaps in its digital security that your IT staff hasn't prioritized because this facility isn't typically a target. I'm not proud of how I accessed some of this, but I'm not going to apologize for it either." "You're describing unauthorized access to classified records," the JAG officer said. "I'm describing the only available method for a person who is legally dead to compile evidence of a war crime." She met his eyes. "You can prosecute me for the access after you've looked at what I accessed." The JAG officer looked at Ferris. Ferris looked at Stokes. Stokes looked at the drive. "I need to verify your identity," Ferris said. "I know," Emily said. "I can provide biometric data, dental records under my operational name, and I have a direct contact number for Colonel Patricia Wren at the 75th Medical Support Detachment who processed my original enlistment. She's retired, but she'll remember me." "That can be verified," Ferris said, "but it'll take time." "We may not have a lot of it," Emily said. She looked at Stokes. "The reason I said earlier that the window closes when Lieutenant Brooks files his report is because the report goes to the facility's senior military liaison. That position is currently held by Brigadier General Marcus Holt." She let the name sit in the air for a moment. "Holt's name appears in the command transcripts on that drive. He was the officer who issued the order to abort extraction without confirming survivor status." The room went very quiet. "He's been assigned to this facility for the last 4 months," Emily continued. "The records review that brought Colonel Stokes here was requested by Holt's office." Ferris set down her pen. She had stopped taking notes and started doing something else with her face, the internal calculation of someone running implications. "You're saying he requested the review himself?" "I'm saying that a man who knows a ghost is somewhere in the system has an interest in controlling where the review looks." Emily folded her hands on the table. "I've been careful for 14 months. I've been careful about which files I accessed, how I accessed them, and what trail I left. But when Brooks's security flag triggered this morning and the review team arrived, I knew the window was either opening or closing, one or the other." "You could have come forward earlier," Brooks said from the wall. His voice was quieter than it had been. Not accusatory now, something more complicated. To who? Emily said. And there wasn't heat in it. The chain of command that signed my death certificate? The facility run by the man whose order caused the mission to fail? She looked at him directly. I came forward when there were people in the room who weren't his people. That's now. Brooks was quiet. He was looking at the table, not at her, and the expression on his face was the one he'd been wearing since she'd named Aaron in Ward C. The expression of someone carrying a wound that had been told it was one shape for 4 years and was only now beginning to understand it was another. Ferris picked up the USB drive. She turned it over once in her hand. I'm going to need to run verification before we proceed. I know, Emily said. But while you're running it, I need someone to check the status of a special operations element designated Kestrel 4. They've been in the field in the cavern corridor for 11 days. Their extraction window is 48 hours out. She paused. The intelligence that positioned them was based on a command assessment that used the same falsified data from Nightgate. If Holt's team has been feeding current operations with corrupted source material, stop, the JAG officer said. He had his hand up. His voice had changed register in the way voices did when something moved from procedural to urgent. What exactly are you saying about Kestrel 4? I'm saying that the same pattern of false positioning intel that put Aaron Brooks's unit in the path of that secondary charge is currently informing the operation Kestrel 4 is running. She said it plainly, because there was no other way to say it that would make it land faster. I noticed the parallels 4 months ago. I've been watching the command pattern since. I'm not certain. I want to be honest about that. But I'm close enough to certain that I think it has to be flagged right now. The JAG officer stood up. He moved to the corner of the room and had his phone out before he was fully turned around. Stokes leaned forward. His voice dropped to something that was not quite a whisper, but was heading there. If you're right about Kestrel 4, then we don't have 48 hours, Emily said. We have less. Brooks had moved away from the wall. He was standing in the middle of the room now, between Emily and the door, and he was looking at her with the undivided attention of someone who had arrived at a place in a conversation that he hadn't expected to reach. The pattern, he said. Show me. Emily looked at him. She reached over and touched the USB drive, still in Ferris's hand. Captain Ferris needs that for verification, but I can walk you through what I know from memory. She looked at him steadily. It's going to be hard to hear. I've been hearing hard things about that mission for 4 years, Brooks said. Try me. She held his gaze for a moment. He was not the man from the corridor, not the one who'd shoved her into the nursing station wall, not the one who'd said adequate like it was a slur. He was, right now, just a man who had lost his brother and had been told one story about why, and who was beginning to understand that the story had been designed to make him stop looking. All right, Emily said. Then let's start with why the secondary charge was in a location that wasn't in any of the pre-mission intelligence reports. And outside the conference room door, down the long administrative corridor, a door opened. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving toward them. Emily heard them before anyone else did. She recognized the cadence. She'd been listening to it for 14 months, in the way you listen to the specific sound of something you needed to track. She looked at Stokes. Who else knows we're in this room? Stokes frowned. I didn't. He stopped. He looked at the door. The footsteps stopped outside it. Ferris had the USB drive in her jacket pocket. The JAG officer had his phone pressed to his ear. Brooks was between Emily and the door, and Emily was already doing the calculation, the same one she'd spent 4 years getting good at, of what the next 60 seconds could look like, and how many of the possible versions of it ended in something useful. The door handle turned. The door opened inward, and Brigadier General Marcus Holt walked through it like a man who owned every room he'd ever entered. He was 63, thick through the chest and shoulders, in the way of someone who had been physically imposing once and had let that memory do the work in the years since. His uniform was immaculate. His face was composed in the specific way of people who had long practice at walking into difficult situations and controlling them through sheer presence before the first word was said. He looked at the room. Stokes, Ferris, the JAG officer still on his phone, Brooks, Emily. and his expression sorted through each of them the way you sorted mail, quick and automatic, assigning weight and relevance. His eyes landed on Emily last. They stayed there a beat longer than the others. "Colonel Stokes," he said. "I wasn't notified this meeting had expanded." Stokes straightened slightly. "Not much. Enough." "General Holt, the review developed additional dimensions this morning." "So I'm hearing." Holt moved into the room without being invited further in, the way senior officers did when they decided the invitation was implied. He looked at Ferris. "Captain, I wasn't aware IG had a representative on site." "We arrived this morning, sir," Ferris said. Her voice was even. She had the USB drive in her jacket pocket, and her hand was not anywhere near it. Holt looked at the JAG officer, who had lowered his phone but not ended the call. Then he looked at Emily again. "You're the nurse," he said. "Yes, sir," Emily said. He studied her for a moment with the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned to look at people without showing what he was seeing. Whatever he was seeing, he had it contained. "There's apparently been some kind of incident in the ward this morning," he said. "I've been informed that a civilian staff member made claims regarding classified operations." "That's an accurate summary," Emily said. "I think we should get HR involved and handle this through the appropriate channels." He said it to Stokes, not to Emily, the way people referred to inconvenient objects in the third person while the object was still in the room. The young woman is clearly, there may be a psychological component here that warrants a compassionate response before we go further. Emily felt the old familiar shape of it, the smoothness of the redirect, the way it dressed dismissal up as concern. She had expected it. She had in fact been counting on it. "General Holt," she said, "do you remember a combat medic attached to the 75th MSD in 2021? Operational deployment, Kavarin Province, the support element for Nightgate." Something moved across his face, very fast, very small, gone before it arrived. "I don't see how that's relevant to—" "Her name was Staff Sergeant Mira Voss," Emily said. "She was listed KYA in the after-action report filed under your authorization on September 14th of that year." She held his gaze. "You signed that report, General. I've read it many times." The room had gone the particular kind of still that preceded things that couldn't be undone. Holt turned to Stokes. His voice had shifted, still controlled, but the control was doing more work now. "Colonel, I'd like the civilian removed while we sort out what's actually happening here." "Sir," Stokes said, "given what's been presented, I'm not asking for a discussion. I'm giving direction." Holt's voice had the quality of something compressed. "Remove her," Brooks spoke from across the room. "She has Aaron's dog tag." Holt turned to look at him. The look lasted exactly 2 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than it needed to be if the name meant nothing. "Lieutenant," Holt said carefully, "grief can—" "Don't." Brooks's voice was quiet, flat. "Don't tell me what grief can do, sir. Tell me how a civilian nurse in Colorado has my brother's identification tag." Holt looked between Brooks and Emily. Then he looked at Ferris, who had her legal pad in front of her and whose pen was moving. He looked at the JAG officer, who had drifted back toward the corner of the room with his phone and whose posture had the specific alertness of someone who had already made a call and was waiting for the return. "This conversation," Holt said, "is over until we have proper protocol." "The conversation about Kestrel 4 can't wait for protocol," Emily said. 11 days in field. 48-hour extraction window. Command intel sourced from the same corrupted data architecture that positioned Aaron Brooks's unit over a secondary charge. She said it directly at Holt. "You know the Kavarin corridor. You know what the ground looks like when the intelligence has been shaped rather than gathered." The temperature in the room dropped. Holt stared at her. For the first time since he'd walked through the door, his face was not doing what he wanted it to do. "That information is classified at a level that I shouldn't have," Emily said. "I know. We've established that I have things I shouldn't." She looked at him steadily. "The question is what we're going to do about Kestrel 4 in the next hour, and what we're going to do about how they got put where they are." The JAG officer spoke from the corner. "General Holt, I'm going to need you to remain in this room." Holt turned to him sharply. "Excuse me?" "I have a call running with JAG oversight and IG coordination at the Pentagon level." Given what's been brought forward this morning, I'm not in a position to allow anyone to leave this room until we have verification protocols in place. The JAG officer was young, maybe 35, and he had the particular look of someone who knew exactly how much professional risk he was currently absorbing and had decided it was worth it. This is not a request, sir. I'm asking for your cooperation. For 10 seconds, nobody moved. Holt stood in the middle of the room with 4 people looking at him and the specific weight of a situation that had gotten away from him pressing down from all sides. Emily watched him process it, watched him run the calculation, the same way she ran calculations, and arrive at the answer that a man in his position arrived at when the exits were closing. He sat down. Not capitulation, not yet, but the standing had become untenable, and he was smart enough to know it. Ferris worked fast. Emily had expected her to once the room had stabilized. The IG people who lasted were the ones who shifted gears without announcing the shift. Ferris had her laptop open, the USB drive plugged in, and was running the file authentication sequence with the focused economy of someone who had done this before in situations where time was the variable that mattered most. Stokes was on a secure line in the adjoining office. Through the wall, Emily could hear the cadence of the conversation without the words, and the cadence told her enough. The pauses were short, which meant the people on the other end were already engaged, already moving. Brooks had pulled a chair up across from Emily. He wasn't interrogating her. He was listening, which was different. His forearms were on the table, and he had the careful stillness of someone who had decided that what he needed right now was information more than he needed to do anything with his hands. "Walk me through the 72 hours before the mission," he said. Emily did. She had the timeline memorized, had gone over it so many times in the preceding years that it lived in her not as narrative but as structure, the way anatomical knowledge lived in the hands of someone who had worked with it long enough. She laid it out flat and factual. The intelligence brief that had positioned the element, the anomalies in the source material that she'd flagged to her supervising officer, the flag that had gone nowhere, the command override that had confirmed the mission parameters over medical and logistics objections. "You flagged it," Brooks said, "twice. In writing the first time, the second time in person, to the liaison officer." She paused. The liaison officer for that operation was under Holt's direct command. Brooks looked at the table. His jaw moved once. Aaron mentioned in his last communication that something felt wrong about the positioning intel. He said it in a way that he wasn't someone who said that kind of thing without a reason. He was right, Emily said. The IED was placed based on local information that had been sold twice, once to the operations intelligence apparatus, and once, we believe, to the network that placed it. The source had been compromised. That information was available in the raw intelligence before it was processed into the command brief. It didn't make it into the brief. "Because someone pulled it," Brooks said. "Because someone pulled it," Emily agreed. Brooks looked up at her. His eyes were red at the edges in the way eyes went when a person was not going to let themselves do the thing their body was trying to do. "Why are you still here?" he asked. "You survived. You had the information. You could have—" "There are oversight bodies, congressional contacts." "You need documentation that can't be disputed," she said. "Testimony from a person who is legally dead, without corroborating records, from inside a system that has been deliberately shaped against that testimony. It gets buried. It gets characterized. I needed what's on that drive." She looked at him steadily. "And I needed the right investigation. Holt's office has blocked or redirected 2 previous IG inquiries into Nightgate. This one came from a different entry point. It came because of discrepancies in transfer records that weren't connected to Nightgate directly. He didn't see it coming the same way." "You knew that," Brooks said. "I've been watching his patterns for 14 months, she said. "Yes." He held her gaze. "My brother's last full sentence was your name." She didn't look away. "I know." He said, "He asked someone to find you. After." Brooks stopped, pressed his knuckles against the table once, briefly. "They told us there was nothing to find, that the medical personnel on scene hadn't made it out." "The medical personnel on scene was me," Emily said, "and I didn't make it out clean, but I made it out." Ferris looked up from her laptop 17 minutes after she'd started. 17 minutes was fast for the kind of authentication she was running, and fast meant she'd hit something significant quickly rather than working through layers. The command logs on this drive don't match the official record, she said. She said it without inflection, which was how people delivered things that were large enough that emotional inflection would have been inadequate. The official record shows confirmation of extraction abort at 0340. The logs on this drive show the abort was called at 0318 and that there was a communication at 0327, 22 minutes after the abort, while personnel were still in the field, that was not logged in the official record. What was the communication? Stokes asked from the doorway. He had come back in without Emily noticing. Coordinates, Ferris said. Transmitted from the command element to a receiver that is not in the official communication log. She looked at Holt. General, I'm going to need your cooperation with some questions. Holt had been quiet for 12 minutes. The quiet of a man who had been doing his own calculating and had arrived somewhere he hadn't expected. He looked at Ferris, and for just a moment the composure cracked at the edges. Not dramatically, not completely, just enough to show what was underneath it. What was underneath it was not a monster. It was something more ordinary and more terrible. A man who had made a catastrophic decision under pressure and had spent 4 years constructing architecture to contain it. I want JAG counsel present, he said. That's your right, sir, Ferris said. But I need you to understand that the Kestrel 4 situation, I'll address Kestrel 4 separately, Holt said. Sir. Emily spoke. She kept her voice level, no edge in it, because edge would have given him somewhere to push back. The communication at 0327, the coordinates that went to an unlogged receiver, that pattern has appeared twice in the current operational cycle. In the Kestrel 4 positioning brief, the same sourcing signature, the same transmission pattern. She let that settle. If there's someone in the current operation receiving command coordinates from an unlogged channel, Kestrel 4 is walking into the same ground Aaron Brooks's unit walked into. Holt stared at her. The JAG officer moved from the corner to the table. He put both hands flat on it and leaned forward. General, operational security for a current active element supersedes everything else in this room right now. If you have information relevant to Kestrel 4's positioning, you need to give it to me right now. The silence stretched for 4 seconds. 5, 6. The source, Holt said. His voice had gone to something different, quieter, the way things went quiet after a structure gave way. The source they're using in the cavern corridor, it's the same network. He stopped. It was compromised before Nightgate. I knew it was compromised. The decision to proceed, General. The JAG officer's voice was not loud, but had the quality of something that could get louder. Kestrel 4. The positioning intel they've been given has a 12-hour lag built into it, Holt said. The terrain assessment doesn't account for the route change that network signaled 3 days ago. If they move on the primary approach at the extraction window, the JAG officer was already on his phone. He turned to the wall, and the conversation he had started went from one register to another, and then to another, each shift faster than the last. Emily heard active operation and command advisory, and then the words compressed into something too quick to separate. Brooks was on his feet. He wasn't looking at Holt. He was looking at Emily, and his face had resolved into something that was not anger and not grief, but was the specific expression of a person standing at the exact moment where two realities, the one they'd been living in and the one that had actually been true, were finishing the process of exchanging places. They're going to get out, Emily said. She said it to him directly. Kestrel 4. If the advisory gets through in time, they'll adjust the approach. They'll get out. You don't know that, he said. No, she said. But the information is moving now, which is the only thing that gives it a chance. She held his gaze. That's all we ever had. Information moving toward the right people before the window closed. In the corner of the room, Holt had his hands on the table in front of him and was looking at them. Not at Emily, not at Brooks. At his own hands. The posture of a man who had arrived at the end of a very long construction project and found it insufficient. Ferris was still working. Her fingers moved over the keyboard and she was pulling files from the drive, cross-referencing, building the documented record that transformed testimony into evidence. The room had the sound of urgent, focused work, keyboards, phone calls, the scratch of Ferris's pen when she moved from digital to analog, because some things you still wrote by hand to make them real. Emily sat in the middle of all of it. 14 months of careful, isolated, grinding work was collapsing into hours, and the specific exhaustion of that, the way a long project didn't release you cleanly but released you all at once, like pressure leaving a sealed space, was beginning to settle in her shoulders, her hands, the muscles around her eyes. She hadn't slept more than 5 hours in the last 2 days. She was reaching for the cup of water someone had left on the table when Ferris said quietly, "Mira." Emily looked up. Nobody in the room had called her that until now. Ferris had her screen angled slightly toward her. On it was a personnel record, the real one, the pre-2021 one, the one that existed in the system before the KYA designation had collapsed it into a death file. Photograph, service record, commendations. The name at the top, Voss, Mira A., Staff Sergeant. "Your dental records confirmed 20 minutes ago," Ferris said. "Colonel Wren is on a call with Colonel Stokes now. She identified you from a physical description before we even got to the records." Ferris looked at her steadily. "You are who you say you are." Emily looked at the record on the screen. At the photograph, taken 7 years ago, a person who was recognizably her but younger and in uniform, and with the particular expression of someone who had not yet done the things that the subsequent years would require. She felt something move through her that she didn't have a clean name for. Not relief, exactly. More like a door that had been sealed for a very long time, making the first small sound of opening. "Thank you," Emily said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "Don't thank me yet," Ferris said. She turned the screen back. "We have a problem." The file she was looking at now wasn't Emily's. It was a communication record pulled from the drive's secondary partition, time-stamped 6 hours ago. This morning, before the review team had arrived, before Emily had gone toward C, before the corridor. Someone sent a compressed file from this facility's internal network at 0614 this morning, Ferris said. Encrypted, external recipient. The encryption signature matches a pattern associated with... She stopped. She looked at Holt, then she looked at Emily. "It matches a pattern we've seen in 2 previous cases connected to the Nightgate file." Emily felt it before she understood it, the shape of it. "What was in the file?" "We don't have that yet," Ferris said. "We have the size and the destination signature. The destination is outside the country." The room was very quiet. "The size," Emily said. "How big?" Ferris told her. Emily put the water cup down. She looked at Ferris and then at the door and then back at Ferris. The size of the file was consistent with one thing. One specific thing that she knew existed in this facility's system because she had found it 3 months ago and had made a decision not to touch it because touching it would have told someone she was looking. The personnel roster for Kestrel 4. The real one. Names, photographs, operational cover identities, family contact information. Someone had sent that file out of this building 6 hours ago. 6 hours before Holt had walked through the conference room door. 6 hours before the review team had arrived. Someone who knew the team was coming. Emily looked at Holt. He was looking at the table. His hands, which had been still, were no longer. "General," she said, and her voice, which had been steady all morning through everything, the corridor, the dog tag, the conference room, the authentication, all of it, had something in it now that hadn't been there before. Something that was not fear, but was adjacent to it. Who else knew the IG team was coming today? Holt didn't answer, but the answer was already in the room, in the stillness of a man who had spent 4 years managing the consequences of one catastrophic decision and had, sometime in the years since, stopped managing and started compounding. The JAG officer had turned from the wall. His phone was down. He was looking at Emily, and his face had the expression of someone who had just understood that the situation they were in was a different situation than the one they'd thought they were in 30 seconds ago. "We need to lock down the network," Emily said, "right now. And someone needs to tell me if there is a secondary operational file for Kestrel 4 stored anywhere outside this building's system." Nobody answered fast enough. And somewhere outside, in the corridor, or further, in the facility's administrative wing, a door opened, and then another one, and the sound that followed was not footsteps. It was the specific, unmistakable sound of a building going into alert. The alert sound at Redstone Veterans Medical Center was not a klaxon. It was 3 ascending tones repeated at intervals, which sounded almost musical until you understood what it meant. Controlled lockdown, non-emergency protocols, which was the facility's way of saying something is wrong, but we're not telling you what yet. Emily had heard it twice in 14 months. Once for a power failure. Once for a patient who had walked off the ward. She had never heard it for the reason it was running now. The JAG officer, his name was Captain David Reyes, which Emily had caught from Ferris's notes, was already at the door. Building network, he said, to no one specifically. Can we isolate the administrative servers from the external connection? Facilities management, Stokes said. He was back on his phone. That takes too long, Emily said. She stood up. The IT office for the administrative wing is on this floor, east end, past the records room. 2 people work the morning shift. If they haven't already seen the flag on that outbound file, they will in the next few minutes when the system auto-logs it for review. She looked at Reyes. Someone needs to be in that office before whoever sent the file realizes the alert tripped. Reyes looked at her for exactly half a second. The look of a person deciding whether to take tactical direction from someone who had no official standing in the room, and then turned to the liaison officer who had been mostly furniture since the meeting had reorganized itself. Caldwell, IT office. Don't touch anything, just hold the room until I get there. Caldwell left at a pace that was not quite running in the way military personnel didn't quite run indoors. Holt had not moved from his chair. He was watching the room operate around him with the expression of a man observing something from behind glass, present, aware, but separated from the machinery of it by a distance that was growing with each passing minute. Emily noticed he had stopped looking at her directly. He was looking slightly to the left of her or slightly past her, the way people avoided eye contact when they had run out of the resource that made it bearable. She didn't have time to think about what that meant yet. The roster file, she said to Ferris. If it went out at 0614, that's 6 hours. Whatever it was used for, it's been in the recipient's hands long enough to act on. Or long enough to pass along, Ferris said without looking up. Same problem, worse version. Emily moved toward the door. Where are you going? Brooks asked. Webb's monitoring cycle is overdue by 20 minutes, she said, and I need to walk the ward. That's not... Captain Ferris has the drive. Colonel Stokes has the secure line. Captain Reyes has the IT office. You have Holt. She looked at Brooks directly. I'm the only person in this building who has been paying attention to both the patient population and the administrative patterns for 14 months. If something is moving in this building right now, I want to see it on the floor, not hear about it secondhand. She paused. Also, Webb genuinely needs his antibiotic check. Brooks looked at her for a moment, then at Holt, then back at her. He was running the same calculation she was, who needed to be where, and arriving at the same answer. Don't leave the building, he said. Where would I go? Emily said, and walked out. The ward was different, not visibly. The beds were occupied by the same people they'd been occupied by this morning. The monitors ran their steady commentary of numbers and waveforms. Patrice was at the nursing station reviewing the afternoon schedule, with the particular focus of someone who was aware that things were abnormal without knowing the specific shape of the abnormality. But there was a texture to the air, a slight tightening in the way people moved, the way eyes tracked, that Emily recognized from other environments. The building-wide sense that something is off, distributed through every person in the space without any of them having the vocabulary for it yet. She went to Webb first. His fever had dropped a half degree, which was the antibiotic doing what it was supposed to, slow and chemical and indifferent to everything else happening in the building. She checked his drainage site, recorded his vitals, and was updating his chart when he said, without opening his eyes, "How bad is it?" "Infection's responding," she said. "Not what I meant." Emily looked at him. His eyes were open now, watching her the way he'd been watching her all day, with the assessment of someone who had learned to read environments by reading the people in them. "I don't know yet," she said. "Stay on the bed." "That's all I've got," he said. She moved to the next patient, a retired master sergeant named Dolores Van, 61, 6 days post-cardiac catheterization, whose numbers were stable and whose disposition toward the entire situation was stoic, in the way of someone who had survived worse and fully expected to survive this. Emily adjusted Van's oxygen flow, noted the chart, and had moved to the third bed when she saw it. The door to the ward's secondary entrance, the one that connected to the facility's service corridor, which ran behind the wards and was used for equipment transport and laundry, was open. A half-inch. No more. It should have been closed. It was always closed. There were no deliveries scheduled for Ward C this afternoon because Emily had checked the schedule at 6:45 that morning and it had been clear. She did not change her pace. She finished the third patient's chart, moved to the fourth, and in the 30 seconds between those two beds, she ran a count of every person visible in the ward and compared it against who should be there. Patrice. 2 nurses. A dietary aide finishing a late lunch delivery 3 beds down. A military liaison she recognized from the facility's patient advocacy office who sometimes walked the ward and who she had no specific reason to distrust and one specific reason to notice. He had arrived in the ward approximately 4 minutes ago while Emily had been focused on Webb, and he was standing near the secondary door. She finished her notes, walked to the nursing station, said to Patrice quietly, her back to the ward, "The secondary door is open." Patrice glanced up. "It shouldn't be." "No." Emily kept her voice level. "I need you to move everyone who can be moved to the far end of the ward. Non-emergency transfer, routine repositioning, whatever reason you want to give. Don't alarm anyone. Just get them toward the primary entrance." Patrice looked at her for a beat. She had known Emily for 14 months and had learned in that time that when Emily said something needed to happen, the discussion about why could usually wait. "All right," she said. Emily turned and walked toward the liaison officer near the secondary door. His name was Warrant Officer Tate. She'd read his name off his badge 3 weeks ago in a corridor and filed it automatically. He was 38, mid-build, with the kind of forgettable face that worked well in institutional settings. She had never had a direct conversation with him. She had seen him in the administrative wing twice in the past week, which was 2 more times than she'd seen him there in the preceding 13 months. "Warrant Officer Tate," she said. He turned. His expression was calibrated to something between neutral and pleasant. "Nurse Carter, the door behind you is supposed to be secured." He looked at the door as if he'd only just noticed it. "Must have not latched properly," he said. "It latches automatically," Emily said. "There's a pressure seal. You have to hold it open." A half second. Not long. But there. "I'll let facilities know," he said. "Appreciate it," Emily said. She was looking at his hands, which were empty, and at his right hip, where his radio was clipped, and at his left side where a jacket he hadn't been wearing this morning now hung. "There's an alert running. Administrative directive is for all non-essential personnel to clear the clinical wards until the all clear." "I have patient advocacy rounds." "Directive supersedes rounds," Emily said. "You can check with the liaison office if you need confirmation." He looked at her. She looked at him. 2 people conducting an entirely polite conversation that was not, in any meaningful way, polite. "Sure," he said. He moved toward the primary entrance without looking back. Emily watched him go. Then she turned and walked to the secondary door and looked through the gap into the service corridor. It was empty, but the latch mechanism had something caught in it. A small wedge of plastic, the kind that would have been invisible if you weren't looking for it, that was keeping the pressure seal from engaging. She left it in place. She pulled out her phone and typed a message to the number Reyes had given her 20 minutes ago. "Secondary service corridor, Ward C rear entrance. Someone propped the latch. Warrant Officer Tate, patient advocacy, just left the ward through the primary. Check his jacket." She sent it and put her phone away and walked back to finish her medication rounds because Webb's antibiotic check was still 3 minutes overdue and the infection didn't care about anything else happening in the building. Reyes found the wedge 11 minutes later. He found 3 other things in the same corridor. A burner phone with 2 outgoing calls made in the previous 4 hours, a jacket that had been left behind a laundry cart, and Warrant Officer Tate attempting to exit the building through the facility's loading dock, where he was met by 2 military police who had been positioned there on Stokes's direction 8 minutes earlier. Emily heard about it in pieces. Reyes appeared in the ward doorway, told her Tate was in custody, and gave her a look that was the specific expression of someone revising a professional assessment rapidly upward. She nodded, went back to charting. Her hands were steadier than they had any business being given the last several hours, which she attributed to the fact that hands that had kept composure through worse things developed a kind of muscle memory for it. What Tate had on him, and what the burner phone confirmed, took another 90 minutes to develop fully. Emily spent those 90 minutes doing her job. The actual job she'd been hired to do, the one she'd been doing with genuine care for 14 months, regardless of the other reasons she was there. She discharged 2 patients who were ready to go home. She coordinated a specialist consult for a third. She sat for 6 minutes with a veteran named Raymond Colby, who was 73 years old and had nobody coming to pick him up, and who needed someone to tell him the surgery had worked in a way that he could actually hear. The work grounded her. It always had. That was something she hadn't expected when she'd first come to Redstone. That she would mean it. That the caring for people would become real rather than remaining instrumental. She'd thought she would stay detached, nurse as cover, rather than nurse as self. It hadn't worked out that way, which said something about her that she didn't yet have the energy to fully examine. At 3:45, Reyes came to find her and asked her to come back to the conference room. The room had changed shape again. There were more people in it. 3 individuals she didn't recognize in civilian clothes with the bearing of federal investigators. A woman in her 50s with a JAG insignia who had clearly arrived from somewhere else and was running the room's authority now. And a signals intelligence specialist who was working from a laptop connected to what appeared to be a secondary secure line. The smell of coffee that nobody had drunk was in the air. Holt was still there. He had JAG counsel now, a young captain who sat beside him and put his hand on Holt's arm at intervals in the way counsel did when they were trying to manage how much their client said. Holt looked, in the 90 minutes since Emily had last seen him, like he had aged in the specific way that happened when something a person had been holding up collapsed, and the effort of holding it became visible all at once. The woman with the JAG insignia was Colonel Patricia Osei. She was the one Reyes had called that morning, the oversight coordinator whose authorization had been needed before the room could go where it needed to go. She looked at Emily when Emily came in, and the look was long and assessing and not unfriendly. "Staff Sergeant Voss," Osei said. Emily felt the name land differently in this room than it had anywhere else today. More real. More specific. "Yes, ma'am. Your identity has been confirmed through dental records, biometric comparison, and testimony from Colonel Patricia Wren, now retired, and 2 other officers who served alongside you before 2021. Osei's voice was level and informational. "You are being formally recognized as alive and as a former member of the United States Army. The KIA designation will be reviewed and corrected through official channels." She paused. "That process will take time." "I know," Emily said. "In the meantime, you have cooperated with an active federal investigation, provided material evidence of command-level falsification of military records, and identified a present security threat that has resulted in the apprehension of Warrant Officer First Class Dennis Tate." Osei looked at her steadily. "We need your testimony formalized, today." "Yes, ma'am," Emily said. "But I need to know about Kestrel 4 first." Osei looked at Reyes. Reyes looked at the signals intelligence officer, who spoke without looking up from his screen. "The operational advisory reached Kestrel 4's command element 2 hours and 17 minutes ago. Element confirmed receipt and adjusted the primary approach. They are currently moving toward the secondary extraction point." He did look up then. "They're out of the kill zone." Emily put her hand on the back of a chair. She didn't sit down. She just held the chair for a moment, which was the only visible accommodation she made to what she was feeling. "Thank you," she said. To the room, to nobody specifically. The formalized testimony took 4 hours. Emily sat across from Osei and a federal investigator named Marsh, different Marsh, no relation to the administrator, and went through everything in the sequence it had happened, which was different from the sequence she'd told it in pieces throughout the day. Linear was harder. Linear required her to inhabit each part of it rather than extract the relevant pieces, and some parts of it were not things she'd had time or space to inhabit properly in 4 years. The mission. The vehicle hit, Aaron Brooks pulling two men from the wreckage with his hands. The drainage ditch and the dark and the sounds that she had filed away in a part of herself that didn't get opened unless it had to. The 3 days she'd spent in the field before she reached a position where she could be extracted without going back through official channels. The 6 weeks after that, in a civilian hospital in a city that had nothing to do with any of it, while her own records were being updated to say she was dead. She told it without embellishment because embellishment was something she'd never had the taste for, and because the facts, laid bare, were sufficient. She told them about the first moment she'd understood what had happened. Not that she'd survived, but that her survival had been recorded differently. The feeling of reading your own casualty report was not something she could describe in a way that was both accurate and brief, so she didn't try. She told them what she'd done instead: gotten a nursing credential under the name Emily Carter, gotten a job, built toward a position where the evidence she'd gathered could reach the people equipped to use it. 14 months, the federal investigator said. That's a long time to be patient. It's a short time to build a case that can't be killed by one phone call, Emily said. He looked at her. Then he wrote something down. Brooks was in the room for part of it. He sat in the chair against the wall that he'd occupied for most of the day. And he listened with the same focused stillness he'd shown since the corridor. And at the part where she described Aaron, specifically the part where she described the 40 minutes between the abort and the explosion, what Aaron had done in those 40 minutes for the people around him, Brooks put his hand over his mouth and kept it there for a while. Emily didn't look at him while she was talking about it. She looked at the table because looking at the table was the only way to get through it with her voice doing what she needed it to do. When that section was done, Osei called a 10-minute break. Emily went to the water cooler in the administrative corridor and drank 2 cups and stood with her back against the wall and breathed. 14 months of maintenance and careful watching and not letting herself be known had spent itself out through the last 9 hours. And what was left was not emptiness exactly, but the specific texture of something that had been running at high tension for a very long time finally being allowed to stop. Brooks appeared at the end of the corridor. He walked toward her and stopped a few feet away and stood there in the way of someone who had things to say and hadn't sorted them into order yet. He wasn't, "They told us the mission failed because of bad positioning intel," Brooks said. "They made it sound like a mistake, an operational error. Nobody's fault, tragic, the investigation was inconclusive." He stopped. "They didn't tell us what he did." "No," Emily said. "You said he got 2 men clear of the vehicle." 3. By the time the smoke cleared, he went back in twice. Brooks pressed his knuckles against his sternum once, briefly. "Why didn't you—" "When you got out, 4 years ago, why didn't you find us then?" "I was trying to stay invisible," she said. "Finding Aaron's family would have put them in the path of whatever was being built to explain his death. And mine." She looked at him. "I made a choice. It was the wrong choice in some ways. I know that." "I'm not saying you were wrong," he said, and she believed him, because he said it the way people said things they'd thought through rather than the way they said things they thought they were supposed to say. "I'm saying it's—" He stopped. "There's a lot to sort out." "There is," she agreed. He looked at her for a moment. The corridor was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the building, the 3-tone alert had been replaced with the all-clear sequence, which meant facilities had been notified that the immediate threat was contained and normal operations could resume within safety parameters. Which meant that somewhere in the wards, Patrice was reorganizing the patient positions she'd shuffled earlier, and the dietary aide was catching up on deliveries, and Corporal Webb was probably arguing with the afternoon nurse about his pain rating again. "My brother said you were the best medic he'd ever worked with," Brooks said. "He mentioned you by name in a letter home, about 6 months before Nightgate. He said you were the kind of person who noticed things before they needed noticing." Emily looked at the wall. The fluorescent light above them buzzed once and steadied. "He was a better person than the mission deserved," she said. "Yeah," Brooks said. "He was." They stood in the corridor for another minute without talking, which was a different kind of silence than all the silences that had preceded it today. Less pressurized. Just 2 people standing in a fluorescent hallway at the end of a very long day, tired in ways that sleep wasn't going to fix immediately, in the space just after the structure of a crisis had dissolved and before the full weight of what came next had settled in. "You should get back in there," Brooks said finally. "Osei runs a tight clock." She does, Emily said. She pushed off from the wall and went back to the conference room. At 6:15, Reyes came in with a laptop and angled it toward the center of the table where Osei and Emily and the federal investigator could see it. Tate is talking, Reyes said. He said it without satisfaction, which was appropriate. Tate's talking was not a resolution. It was the next complication. What Tate said, in a room with his own JAG counsel and 2 military police and a federal investigator who had apparently been looking for him in connection with something else entirely before today, was that he had been operating as a secondary communication channel for a network that he described as administrative support for operations management. He used language that was carefully shaped to minimize personal culpability and maximize the impression of someone who had been doing a job without fully understanding its scope. Nobody in the conference room believed that framing, but what mattered was not the framing. What mattered was the network he was describing, and the names that appeared in it, and the fact that 3 of those names were not Marcus Holt. Holt's counsel was on his feet before the third name had fully processed. Emily looked at the names. She recognized 2 of them from the command communication logs on the drive. The third she knew from a different context, a name she'd encountered in the peripheral record reviews she'd done in the facility's system over the past 14 months. A name attached to procurement decisions, supply chain approvals, budget allocations for medical equipment contracts that had consistently, over a period of 4 years, been awarded to a single vendor whose principal shareholder was not in the official record, but whose ownership structure, if you followed it carefully through 3 holding companies and a registration in a state with minimal disclosure requirements, ended somewhere specific. The contracts, Emily said. Osei looked at her. The procurement fraud, Emily said. It's not separate from Nightgate. It's the reason for it. She was thinking through it as she said it, which was unusual for her. She generally preferred to think things through before saying them, but this was coming together in the room in a way that required speech to fully form. The vendor whose equipment contracts got approved. If Nightgate's mission had succeeded, there was an infrastructure component, medical supply contracts for the operational theater, significant money. If the mission had publicly failed, officially, accountably, with an investigation and real consequences, the contracts get reviewed. But if the failure was quietly classified, if the after-action was controlled, if the KIA designations kept it sealed, the contracts stayed clean, Ferris said. And kept renewing, Emily said. The federal investigator had both hands flat on the table and was looking at her with an expression that was part professional assessment and part something more complicated. You're describing a motive structure that connects command-level military falsification to defense procurement fraud, he said. I'm describing what the documents on that drive, combined with what Tate is saying about the network, suggest when you put them next to the contract records in this facility's procurement database, Emily said, which I can walk you through if you have access to the database. They had access. It took 40 minutes and 2 additional people from the Financial Crimes Unit of the Federal Investigation Team who had apparently been waiting in a room 2 floors down for the conversation to reach them. What they found in those 40 minutes was not complicated once you were looking for it. The sophistication was in the concealment, not the structure. The structure was familiar. Inflated contract values, single-source awards, approval signatures that traced back to officers whose careers had been managed by a person whose name was at the top of a specific chain of command. Holt's name appeared in the approval chain, but it was not at the top. Who's above Holt in this structure? The financial crimes specialist asked. Emily looked at the procurement record on the screen. She had seen this record before, had seen it 9 months ago, during a late-night access session in the records room that she had limited to 45 minutes because she'd been monitoring the building's camera rotation and knew she had a window. She had seen the signature at the top of the approval chain and had noted it and had filed it in the category of things she couldn't pursue without the right investigation in place. The signature at the top of the chain was Brigadier General Marcus Holt's commanding officer, Major General Stuart Vance, whose name appeared in no current investigation, who had retired 8 months ago with full honors, who was currently residing in a private residence outside Ashbury, approximately 11 miles from Redstone Veterans Medical Center, which was not a coincidence that Emily had ever believed for a single day. She said the name. The room went still in a way that was different from earlier stills. Earlier today, the stillness had been the stillness of people processing new information. This stillness was the stillness of people processing information that had scope, the kind of scope that changed the shape of everything around it. Osei looked at the financial crimes specialist. The specialist looked at the federal investigator. Reyes, who had been standing near the wall, moved to the door and stepped outside. And through the door, Emily could hear him on his phone. His voice low and quick and using language that was above her clearance level, but whose urgency was completely audible. Holt's counsel put his hand on his client's arm again. This time Holt didn't seem to register it. He was looking at the screen where Vance's signature sat in the approval chain, and the expression on his face was the specific expression of a man who had just understood that the wall he'd been holding up for 4 years had not been protecting him, had never been protecting him, had been protecting the person standing behind him while he absorbed everything in front. He told me the record adjustment was necessary for operational security, Holt said. His counsel's hand tightened on his arm. He said the KIA designations would be corrected within the classified record once the theater situation stabilized. Sir, his counsel started. They were never going to be corrected, Holt said. Were they? It wasn't a question. Emily didn't answer it as one. No, she said. They weren't. Holt looked at her. It was the first time since he'd sat down that he'd looked at her directly. He looked at her the way you looked at something you'd been looking past for a long time and were only now seeing in its actual shape. Not with remorse exactly. Remorse was something that would come later in other rooms, probably for the rest of his life, in ways he wasn't equipped to calculate right now, but with a recognition that was different from anything else he'd offered her today. How long did you know about Vance? He asked. 9 months, Emily said. You waited 9 months. I needed the investigation to be wide enough to hold him, she said. Holt was the door. Vance was what was behind it. You go through the door before you're ready, you lose what's behind it. Holt was quiet for a moment. Then, you're very patient. I've had practice, Emily said. The next 3 hours operated at a different tempo than anything that had come before. The investigation had a shape now. Not just Nightgate, not just the falsified records, but a structure that connected command decisions to financial outcomes to a man who had managed, through a combination of institutional authority and careful distance, to keep his name off the visible surface of all of it. Reyes coordinated with federal law enforcement. Osei managed the formal testimony process. The financial crimes team pulled records from a procurement database that had not been part of the original review scope and found, in the first hour, 3 additional sets of inflated contract awards tied to the same vendor structure. Emily was asked to remain available, which she did, because there was nowhere she particularly needed to be. She went back to the ward once more, at 7:40, to hand off the last of her patient notes to the evening shift and to check Webb's most recent vitals, which had improved enough that she allowed herself one small, quiet moment of satisfaction about it before returning to the administrative wing. At 9:30, Osei came to find her in the break room where she'd been sitting with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Major General Vance is being contacted at his residence, Osei said. Federal investigators, tonight. Emily nodded. He'll have counsel, Osei said. This will take time. The legal process... I know, Emily said. I've been waiting 4 years. I can wait longer. Osei looked at her for a moment. She had the look of someone who was about to say something that was going to cross from official to personal, and who was deciding whether that was appropriate. She appeared to decide it was. What you did? Building this case from inside the system, under an assumed identity, for 14 months. I want to be clear that I understand what that cost. She paused. What it's still costing. It's fine, Emily said, which was not entirely accurate, but was the only thing available that didn't require more than she had left right now. It's not, Osei said, but we'll deal with that in order. She set something on the table in front of Emily. Your access credentials as Emily Carter are suspended, effective today. Your identity as Mira Voss is restored in the official record, also effective today. She paused. That means you're currently a person without an active role in this facility. Emily looked at the credentials card on the table. 14 months of Emily Carter laid flat on a break room table at 9:30 in the evening. I know, she said. There will be a formal process, Osei said, for reinstatement, if that's something you want, for compensation, for the corrected record, for all of it. It won't be fast. It never is, Osei nodded. She turned to leave and then stopped. There's one more thing, she said. The testimony about the procurement structure, Vance's connection to the vendor. There's a discrepancy in the financial record that we can't explain from the documentation we have. A secondary payment structure that doesn't trace through the vendor. She looked at Emily. The financial crimes team thinks there may be a secondary account set, something outside the procurement chain. Emily looked at her coffee cup. Vance served on the board of a medical logistics company between 2018 and 2020, Emily said, before he was technically required to disclose board memberships under the current ethics regulations. The company was acquired in late 2020 by a private equity firm whose general partner has a documented relationship with the vendor in the procurement chain. She looked up. I have the acquisition documents on the drive. Secondary partition, folder marked miscellaneous. Osei stared at her. I marked it miscellaneous because if someone found the drive and only ran a surface scan, they'd stop at the primary partition, Emily said. The miscellaneous folder has 37 documents. 37, Osei said. Yes. Osei looked at her for a long, measured moment. The expression on her face was not quite admiration. It was something more complicated, more professionally calibrated than that, but it was moving in that direction. Get some sleep, Osei said finally. We'll need you back in at 7. She left. Emily sat in the break room for another few minutes. The building had gone to its overnight quiet, the specific hum of a facility that never fully stopped but reduced itself to a minimum after dark. Somewhere in Ward C, Webb was sleeping on a better antibiotic protocol than he'd had this morning. Somewhere in the administrative wing, Holt was in a room with his counsel, running through the arithmetic of what cooperation might mean against what silence might cost. Somewhere 11 miles away, in a house that had been purchased with money whose origin the financial crimes team would spend the next several months disentangling, Stuart Vance was being informed that federal investigators were at his door. Emily picked up the cold coffee and drank the last of it because she was tired enough that temperature had stopped mattering. Her phone was on the table. She looked at it for a moment, then she picked it up and found the contact she'd created 4 years ago and never called. A number she'd looked up and saved and maintained through 2 phone changes because she hadn't known when she'd need it, but had known that the need would come. Patricia Wren, retired colonel. The woman who had processed Mira Voss's enlistment paperwork in 2015 and had apparently, according to Stokes, identified her from a physical description in under 2 minutes this morning. The call rang twice. I wondered when you were going to find a phone, Wren said when she answered. Her voice was the same as Emily remembered, dry, direct, the voice of someone who allocated words carefully and expected the same from the other end. It's been a complicated day, Emily said. I imagine so, Wren said. Are you all right? Emily thought about the question, not the automatic version of it, which had a reflexive answer, the actual question, whether she was in any meaningful sense all right. Not entirely, she said. That's honest, Wren said. Working on it, Emily said. Outside the break room, footsteps moved down the administrative corridor. Not the heavy footsteps of alert or urgency, the regular, unhurried footsteps of the building going about its night. Emily listened to them pass and fade. There's something I need to tell you, she said into the phone, about Nightgate, about what Vance's people have been doing since. All of it. She paused. It's going to take a while. I've got time, Wren said. And then, in the corridor outside, clear enough to reach through the closed break room door, Emily heard something she hadn't been expecting, a voice she recognized on a phone call, speaking quickly and quietly in the administrative wing that should have been functionally empty at this hour, a voice that belonged to someone she'd seen in the conference room today, someone who had been in and out of every significant conversation since morning. Someone who had known, before anyone else in that room, exactly what was on the secondary partition of her drive. Because she'd told them, she hadn't told anyone else. Emily set her phone face down on the table and sat very still and listened to the voice in the corridor finish its sentence and in the silence that followed, she heard, very distinctly, the sound of the administrative wing's exterior door opening and then closing. She stood up. She moved fast and quiet, the way she'd learned to move in environments where speed and noise were competing priorities and noise always lost. The break room door opened without a sound. The administrative corridor was empty. The overhead lights had switched to their overnight low setting, casting everything in a dimmer, cooler tone that flattened shadows and made distances harder to read. She went toward the exterior door at the corridor's end, not running, but covering ground in the unhurried way that didn't trigger attention from anyone who might be watching. She pushed through the exterior door and stepped into the parking structure's ground-level access lane. Captain Lena Ferris was 40 feet away, walking toward the far stairwell, her jacket collar up, a phone pressed to her ear. She hadn't heard the door. Emily did not call out. She stood and listened. Secondary partition, 37 documents, she said it herself. Acquisition records, board membership, the whole chain? A pause. Ferris was listening to whoever was on the other end. I don't know if Vance's people have already pulled the drive copy or not. The JAG team has the original. Another pause, shorter. I understand. Yes, Emily said, Captain Ferris. Ferris turned. The phone stayed at her ear for 1/2 second, the instinct of completion competing with the instinct of concealment. And in that 1/2 second, Emily saw everything she needed to see. The pause, the choice, the way Ferris lowered the phone and ended the call without saying another word into it. You were the only person I told about the secondary partition, Emily said. Ferris looked at her. Her face had the expression of someone running the remaining options and finding them smaller than she'd hoped. She was a professional, the kind who didn't panic, didn't make it worse with bad improvisation. She stood in the parking lane with her phone at her side and looked at Emily across 40 feet of concrete. How long? Emily asked. A pause, then, since before the review team was assigned. Vance? Through 2 intermediaries, Ferris said. I want you to know I didn't know what I was protecting when it started. By the time you understood, you were in it, Emily said. I know how that works. It's not an excuse, Ferris said. No, it isn't. They looked at each other. The parking structure was cold and still around them, the overhead fluorescents buzzing at a frequency that felt too loud for the quiet. Somewhere above them, on the floors of Redstone Veterans Medical Center, people were sleeping in hospital beds and other people were watching monitors, and all of it was continuing as it always continued, regardless of what happened down here. The drive copy, Emily said. Did Vance's people get it? I don't know, Ferris said. I was told to find out what was on the secondary partition and pass it. I don't know what they did with it. Then you're going to need to tell that to Colonel Osei, Emily said. Right now, tonight. Because if there's a copy of those documents moving towards someone with a reason to use them to destroy the case rather than build one, we have a window and it's closing. Ferris looked at her. You're not going to what? Run? Call building security? Emily shook her head. I'm going to walk you back inside and you're going to tell Osei everything, and then we're going to figure out the damage and whether it's recoverable. She paused. That's what happens next. Just like that. Ferris said. Just like that, Emily said, because the alternative is you walk up those stairs and try to leave this building, and then 2 things happen. You lose any cooperation credit that might make the difference between your career and a federal charge, and the case loses whatever you know about the intermediary chain. She kept her voice even. Not cold, not punishing, just clear. You're not the target, Captain. You know who the target is, so let's go build the case that gets him. Ferris looked at the stairwell, then at Emily. Then she put her phone in her jacket pocket and walked back across the parking lane toward the interior door. Emily held it open for her. They went inside together. Osei was not, by any visible measure, surprised. She had the look of someone who had spent enough years running investigations to know that the circle of people who knew sensitive information was never as controlled as it appeared, and that the radius at which information leaked was directly proportional to how damaging it was. She listened to Ferris for 12 minutes without interrupting. Then she asked 4 questions, each of which Ferris answered completely and without hesitation, which was the only version of this conversation that was going to help anyone. The intermediary chain Ferris described led to a retired warrant officer named Gerald Putt, who acted as a private security consultant and who had been in Vance's orbit since 2019. Putt was 2 degrees from Vance, which was close enough. The copy of the secondary partition documents had been transmitted to a secure drop that Putt controlled. Whether Putt had passed it further was what the next several hours would determine. Reyes coordinated with federal contacts who were already in motion on the Vance arrest. The secondary partition documents were flagged. If they appeared in an unusual place, in an unusual form, in the hands of someone with a reason to use them preemptively, there were now eyes in the right locations to catch it. It was 11:43 when Emily finally sat down in the chair she'd been occupying since that morning and did not get up again for a while. Reyes appeared in the doorway at midnight. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who had been running on urgency for 16 hours and was now feeling the subtraction. He looked at Emily and said, "Putt was taken into custody 40 minutes ago. The copy was on his device and hadn't been transmitted further." He paused. "It's over for tonight." Emily nodded. "You should go home," he said. "I don't technically have a home," she said, which was true. The apartment she'd rented as Emily Carter was paid through the end of the month. And after that, the question of where Mira Voss lived was one she hadn't yet addressed. Reyes looked at her for a moment. "The facility has a guest residence for visiting medical staff," he said. "It's not much, but it's a bed." "That's fine," Emily said. "That's more than fine." She slept for 6 hours. It was not good sleep. The kind of sleep that happened after sustained high alertness was rarely good, tending towards shallow and interrupted, punctuated by the specific images that the brain surfaced when the mechanism that suppressed them during waking hours was finally switched off. Erin in the drainage ditch. The secondary charge and the sound it made. Her own handwriting on an intake form for a civilian hospital in a city she'd chosen because it was far from everything. She woke at 6:15, showered in the guest residence's aggressively utilitarian bathroom, and went back to the main building. The weeks that followed were not cinematic. They were procedural and slow and full of paperwork in quantities that seemed disproportionate to the things they were documenting, and they required Emily's presence in rooms where people asked the same questions in slightly different orders, and she answered them the same way each time, which was the only way to answer them. Major General Stuart Vance was arrested at his residence on the night of Emily's conversation with Ferris in the parking lane. The arrest was not public immediately. Federal investigations of that scope rarely were, but the containment didn't hold past the second week. By the third week, it was in the news, described in the careful language of active federal proceedings, and by the fourth week, the vendor contracts and the procurement fraud and the falsified operational records had been framed in enough specific terms that reporters who had been trying to make sense of vague discrepancies in defense spending for several years had enough material to build from. Holt cooperated fully, which his counsel had apparently advised him was his only viable option. The cooperation didn't erase what he'd done, but it accelerated the investigation in ways that mattered. He was stripped of his commission and charged with falsifying military records, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy, charges that carried weight proportional to their scope and that the military justice system processed, slowly and visibly, over the following months. Vance fought it. Of course he did. He was the kind of man who had spent decades building infrastructure designed to make himself unfightable, and the habits of that project didn't dissolve overnight. He had lawyers and connections, and the particular confidence of someone who had never faced accountability for anything, and had therefore never quite believed it was coming. The confidence lasted until the Financial Crimes Unit finished working through the acquisition records in the secondary partition. After that, it became something else. Not quite cooperation, but a retreat from certainty that looked, from the outside, like a wall finally accepting the existence of gravity. The charge sheet for Vance ran to 11 counts: falsifying military records, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit procurement fraud, dereliction of duty resulting in the deaths of military personnel. The last one had language in it that the lawyers had fought over for 2 weeks, and that Osei had insisted on with a precision that Emily respected enormously. Dennis Tate and Gerald Putt were charged as accessories. Ferris was charged with a lesser count of obstruction, reduced in exchange for full cooperation, a reduction that Emily had not been asked about and would not have tried to influence. That wasn't her call to make. She understood what cooperation credit was and why it existed. Such, the formal correction of the military records, the revision of the KYA designation, and the restoration of Miravos's service history happened on a Thursday in a room in the Pentagon that was smaller than Emily had imagined it would be for an event of this kind. Colonel Wren was there. Ose was there. Reyes was there. Brooks was there in his dress uniform, seated in the row of chairs along the wall, because he had asked to be and because nobody had found a reason to say no. The officer presiding over the correction read the formal language, and Emily sat across from him and signed what needed signing and listened to the words that put her back into the official record as alive, as having served, as having been where she'd been and done what she'd done. It was strange, in a way she didn't have clean language for, to be officially restored to a life that she had in fact been living, uninterrupted, for the 4 years of her supposed death. She hadn't stopped existing when they filed the report. She'd just stopped being acknowledged. Having the acknowledgement returned felt important in ways that were partly institutional and partly, more privately, about something the institutional language didn't quite reach. After the formal portion, in the corridor outside, Wren put her hand on Emily's arm. She was 71 years old and moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had injured her hip 2 years ago and still wasn't satisfied with how it had healed. And she looked at Emily with the specific directness of someone who had known her when she was 22 and first signing paperwork. "You look tired," Wren said. "I am tired," Emily said. "Good," Wren said. "That means you stopped running." She squeezed Emily's arm once, brief and firm. "Now you can figure out what's next." The families received their notifications over a period of 6 weeks, handled through a dedicated team that Ose had assembled for the specific purpose of making sure the information came with enough human support around it that the truth didn't arrive as a second trauma. Emily was not part of that team. She was a witness and a source and an interested party, not a counselor, and the boundaries mattered. But she wrote letters to each family, not long ones. She said what she knew about each soldier's final hours, in terms that were honest without being unnecessary. And she said what those soldiers had done when the options ran out. She did not dress it up. She let the facts carry what they needed to carry. Aaron Brooks' family received their letter last, because that one she rewrote 4 times. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because she wanted to get the balance right, between what was true and what was bearable, between the grief they had already been living with and the grief that came with understanding its actual shape. She finished the final version at 2 in the morning in the apartment she was renting under her own name, in a part of Ashbury she hadn't been in before. The apartment was bare in the way of recently rented spaces. Everything still provisional, nothing accumulated yet. She sealed the letter and put it in the stack with the others and sat for a while in the quiet. The memorial ceremony was held on a Saturday, 6 weeks after Vance's arrest. The Redstone Veterans Medical Center had a memorial garden on its eastern side, a quiet space with a low stone wall along one edge that held the names of personnel who had died while assigned to or treated by the facility, and beyond that, a panel that had been added in the past 10 years for personnel whose deaths were connected to operations run out of the facility's strategic command function. Aaron Brooks's name had always been on that panel. What was new that Saturday was the formal acknowledgement of what his name represented. The public, spoken account of what he had done on September 14th, 4 years ago, in the 40 minutes between an abort order and an explosion, when the official record had simply said mission failure and moved on. Emily stood in dress uniform for the first time in 4 years. It had required a trip to a facility that handled uniform restoration and issue, and the process of standing in front of the measuring room's mirror while someone adjusted the fit had been one of the stranger experiences of the preceding weeks. Not the fit of the fabric, but the fit of the identity. The uniform on the hanger was different from the scrubs she'd worn for 14 months. It was a specific kind of different. She stood with the families along the front row of chairs. Aaron's mother was a small woman in her 60s named Diane, who had driven from Pueblo with a younger daughter and who had met Emily 2 weeks earlier in a different room, and who had, in the middle of that conversation, taken Emily's hands in both of hers and held them without speaking for a long time. There was nothing adequate to say in a moment like that, and Diane Brooks had seemed to know it, which was why she hadn't tried. The ceremony was formal and real, both simultaneously, which was rarer than it should have been. The officer presiding read the corrected records. He named each soldier. He named what they had done. The words were specific rather than vague, which was what made them useful. Not the language of generic honor, but the language of actual events, actual choices, actual people, and actual moments. When Aaron's name was read, Emily looked at the panel, at the engraving that had been there for 4 years while the story around it was being kept wrong. She thought about the drainage ditch in the dark and the weight of the dog tag in her hand, and the specific, unrepeatable fact of a 25-year-old man deciding what to do with the 40 minutes he had left. She thought about the letters she'd written to his family and the 4 drafts it had taken, and whether the final version had gotten it right. She thought it probably hadn't, completely. Some things didn't fit into letters. That didn't mean the letters were the wrong attempt. Brooks stood beside her during the reading. His shoulders were straight in the way of someone who had decided they were going to hold themselves together and had put the effort of the decision into their posture. When Aaron's name was read, he made the sound she'd heard him not make in the conference room 3 weeks ago. Brief, nearly silent, the sound of a pressure system finally releasing. She didn't look at him. Some moments needed the privacy of not being witnessed. Afterward, in the quieter time when the formal portion had ended and people were moving between the chairs and the stone wall, he came to stand beside her at the memorial panel. He had Aaron's dog tag in his hand, not the one Emily had carried for 4 years, though that one had been returned to him through Osei's office, with the chain repaired. This was the facility's formal recognition tag, which the ceremony had included, a small duplicate struck in the style of the original that was meant to be placed at the wall. "You brought them home," he said, quietly. Not for anyone else. Emily looked at the panel, at Aaron's name cut into the stone in the same block letters as the names around it, at the list of people who had not come back from places that would never be fully accounted for, and who deserved, at minimum, the accuracy of the story they'd been in. "No," she said, "the truth did." He placed the tag at the base of the panel. It sat against the stone in the thin morning light, catching it and holding it in the way metal held light, briefly, imperfectly, enough. They stood there for a minute, maybe 2. The families moved around them and the ceremony wound down and the birds in the memorial garden resumed what they'd been doing before all the people arrived, indifferent to any of it in the way that was somehow also a comfort. 3 months later, Emily, Miravos, with a posting under her own name for the first time in 4 years, was assigned to a new position. Not a return to combat medical support, which was not what she'd asked for and not what she was being offered. What she was being offered was something she hadn't expected, a consulting role in operational medical protocol development, working with the same IG office that had run the investigation, focused specifically on the gaps in oversight that had allowed the falsification of Nightgate's records to persist for 4 years. The work was not glamorous. It was meetings and documents and slow bureaucratic processes that moved at the speed of institutions, which was a speed that tested patience in ways that the urgency of a crisis never did. But it was the kind of work that, done carefully and persistently by someone who understood from the inside what the gaps looked like, could close things that didn't get closed by accident. She understood that better than most people in the rooms she now occupied. Reyes was in one of those rooms, on a Tuesday afternoon in the fall, when Emily was presenting the preliminary recommendations from a 6-week analysis of command communication protocols. He listened to the full presentation without interrupting, which was his habit and one she'd come to appreciate. Afterward, in the hallway, he said, "You're going to do this job for a long time." "Probably," she said. "How does that feel?" She considered it, not the reflexive answer, the actual consideration, which took a moment. "Like something I should have done earlier," she said, "and like something that would have meant less if I had." He nodded, slowly. "That's an honest answer." "I've been practicing," she said. Bumped. The verdicts came on a gray November morning. Emily was in the middle of a protocol review meeting when Osei sent the message, 5 words, which was the minimum required to convey what had happened, and was therefore exactly right. All counts. Sentencing in January. She read it twice. Then she set her phone down and finished the meeting because the meeting mattered and the verdict wasn't going anywhere. Afterward, she sat in her office, hers with her name on the door in the institutional font that the building used for everybody, and she thought about the 4 years that had led to 5 words on a phone screen, and about what it cost to carry a truth no one wanted to acknowledge, and about whether it had been worth it. She thought it had been. Not in a clean, satisfying way. The cost had been real, and some of it was not recoverable, and several of the years behind her had been years of a specific, grinding loneliness that she would not romanticize now that they were over. But it had been worth it in the way that only a few things were, not because it had felt good, but because it had been necessary and she had been the person who did it. There was a difference between those two things. She had learned that difference in a drainage ditch at 3 a.m. with someone else's dog tag in her hand, and she had spent 4 years living it, and she was not going to pretend the lesson had been easy to acquire. But she had acquired it, and she was going to use it for as long as she had standing ground. She picked up the phone and called Diane Brooks, not because there was anything specific to say, just because the verdict was real and it deserved to be shared with someone who had needed it as long as Emily had. Diane answered on the second ring. When Emily told her, there was a silence on the other end. The silence of something that had been held in suspension for 4 years finally settling, the way things settled when they were finally allowed to. Then Diane said quietly, "Thank you for not letting them keep it." Emily looked out the window of her office. Ashbury in November, flat and gray and cold, the mountains at the edge of the sky wearing the first serious snow of the season. Not beautiful in any obvious way, just real, visible. "Someone had to keep looking," Emily said. "That's all it was." But that wasn't quite all it was, and they both knew it. It was the willingness to be dismissed, to be invisible, to be shoved toward an exit and steadied yourself on a wall and decided that what you knew mattered more than whether anyone believed you. It was 14 months of ordinary mornings with an extraordinary thing underneath them. It was the understanding, hard-won, specific, not transferable through shortcut, that the people who held the truth carefully when it was dangerous to hold it were the reason the truth survived at all. Emily said goodbye to Diane Brooks and put the phone down and went back to work. There was still a great deal of it left to do.